He was just a quiet black boy in a public school, dreaming out loud about working at NASA, only to be laughed at by his teacher in front of the whole class. But years later, as a limousine pulled up outside that same school, the lesson no one expected was about to begin. This is the unforgettable true story of how one dream, once mocked, soared higher than anyone could imagine, and how it changed not just one life, but many. Before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. The morning sun slanted lazily through the cracked blinds of room 204, painting pale stripes across the linoleum floor and the rows of chipped wooden desks that had seen too many years and too few repairs. The hum of a dusty ceiling fan did little to cut through the weight of late spring in this small Georgia town, and the muffled voice of the principal's morning announcements drifted in from a crackling speaker that hung askew above the chalkboard. It was career day at Chestnut Grove High, and inside this aging classroom, a group of 11th graders sat with the twitchy energy that came from being asked to think too far ahead. The teacher, Mr. Cartwright, stood at the front of the room, arms folded loosely over a mustard yellow sweater vest that had grown threadbare at the elbows. His face, deeply creased from years in the classroom and perhaps a few disappointments of his own, wore an expression that hovered between disinterest and bemused skepticism. His eyes flicked lazily from student to student as they nervously shared their dreams, some grand, some modest, most unremarkable. A nurse, a mechanic, a teacher like him. He nodded through each answer with the same practiced indifference. Then Elijah stood up. A quiet boy with smooth brown skin and eyes like deep water. Elijah rarely spoke unless called on, and even then, his voice was soft, like he was always measuring the weight of his words before setting them down. He held his worn backpack in one hand, his spine straight, his chin just barely lifted. There was a hush in the room, the kind that always fell when Elijah chose to speak. "I want to be an aerospace engineer," he said, the syllables clear and certain. "I want to work at NASA. I want to design propulsion systems that can take humans to Mars." For a brief moment, it was silent. Then came the sound that would brand itself into Elijah's memory for years, the low, unmistakable chuckle from the front of the room. Mr. Cartwright didn't even try to hide it. He looked up at Elijah, amusement dancing in his pale blue eyes, and let out a dry laugh. "You better aim a little lower, son," he muttered, shaking his head. "NASA? That's a mighty tall ladder to climb." A few students laughed with him, some nervously, others with open derision. Elijah didn't flinch, but inside something recoiled. The teacher moved on, calling the next name without missing a beat, as though Elijah's dream had been nothing more than a misfired joke. But Elijah remained standing a second longer than necessary before sitting back down, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the dust dancing in the sunlight. He said nothing, but something quiet and cold settled in his chest. It was not shame nor sadness. It was resolve, the kind that forms only when a dream is tested by mockery and doesn't crumble. After class, as the students spilled out into the hallway, buzzing about prom and college and who was dating who, Elijah walked with steady steps, his face unreadable. He didn't mention what had happened to anyone, not even his mother, when he got home. But that night, after his homework was finished and his little sister had gone to bed, he pulled out an old copy of Space Exploration Today from under his mattress and read it cover to cover for the 100th time, his eyes lingering on a photograph of a Mars rover silhouetted against the red dust of another world. In that photo, he didn't see a machine. He saw proof that dreams, even wild ones, could be made real. What Mr. Cartwright didn't know, what no one in that room could have guessed, was that Elijah's dream hadn't come out of thin air. It was born from stories told by his grandfather, a janitor who once worked at Cape Canaveral and used to bring home discarded mission patches and faded photographs of astronauts standing beside rockets. Every Sunday afternoon, Elijah would sit on the porch beside him, legs swinging off the edge, listening to tales of countdowns and control rooms, of midnight launches that turned the sky white. To the world, his grandfather had been a cleaner of floors, but to Elijah, he was the first man who ever touched the stars. That legacy didn't fit in Mr. Cartwright's cramped worldview, And it certainly didn't belong in a forgotten classroom in a sleepy town. But to Elijah, it was everything. It was the reason he studied long after the television went off. It was why he asked for books instead of toys and saved for secondhand science kits when others were buying sneakers. It was why, despite the laughter and the sideways looks, he would not lower his aim. That night, long after the lights were off, Elijah lay in bed, the hum of crickets outside his window blending with the low whir of a fan in the corner. He stared at the ceiling, not seeing it, but seeing something far beyond it. Mars, Saturn, the stars his grandfather used to point out with fingers that smelled faintly of engine oil. Somewhere out there, rockets were flying. Somewhere, blueprints were being drawn. Somewhere, someone believed a boy like him could build something that would leave Earth behind. He would find those places. He would become one of those people. And someday, he would return to room 204, not to fit into the space they gave him, but to show them how far beyond it he had gone. Before Elijah ever stood in front of that classroom, before the laughter and the sideways glances, before he even understood what the word engineer truly meant, there was only a porch, a rocking chair, and the low, gravelly voice of his grandfather weaving stories into the twilight. Those evenings were sacred in their simplicity. While other children were glued to television sets or chasing fireflies across the yard, Elijah sat at the feet of a man who had once cleaned the floors at a place where rockets kissed the heavens. His grandfather, Leonard Gaines, never boasted, never embellished, but his stories, full of detail and quiet wonder, painted vivid pictures that no book could match. He spoke of the thick Florida heat on launch days, of the distant rumble that shook the very ground beneath his boots when the countdown reached zero. He remembered how even from behind fences and glass, the fire of those engines lit up the sky like a new dawn. To a child with a head full of questions and a heart hungry for more, those stories were not just memories. They were blueprints. It was on one of those dusky evenings that Elijah first asked the question that changed everything. "Did you ever want to fly in one of those, Granddad?" Leonard had paused, his eyes fixed on some far-off point past the treetops. Then he had smiled, the corners of his mouth pulling gently toward his weathered cheeks. "I wanted to, boy," he said softly. "But back then, men like me didn't get asked to fly. We were lucky just to sweep the floor." Elijah didn't understand the full weight of those words at the time, but he felt something heavy in them, something unspoken. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Then I'll fly for both of us someday." And Leonard had only nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. From that day on, the dream was no longer abstract. It had a shape, a reason, a name. It wasn't about fame or even escape. It was about finishing something that had been left undone, breaking a cycle that told boys like Elijah to stay in their place. While his classmates thumbed through comic books and obsessed over football stats, Elijah devoured books about the Apollo missions, about thrust equations and orbital mechanics. He spent weekends at the public library, where a kind old librarian named Mrs. Bell began setting aside science magazines just for him. He collected them like treasure, storing them in neat stacks beneath his bed and rereading them until the pages curled at the edges. At school, his fascination made him a target. He was the space boy, the kid who doodled rockets in his margins instead of rap lyrics or flames. But Elijah didn't mind. In fact, the isolation sharpened his focus. While others drifted from one interest to another, he was charting a course with a destination he could almost touch. Still, even with all the determination in the world, there were barriers he couldn't control. The school's science resources were outdated. The one working computer in the lab was usually claimed by louder voices. His teachers, while not outright cruel, often overlooked him, assuming his quiet demeanor meant he lacked drive. Except for one. Miss Dandridge, a soft-spoken black woman who taught English, occasionally pulled him aside to ask about the articles she saw peeking from his backpack. She never pretended to know what he was reading, but she always said the same thing. "Keep going. There's room for you out there." At home, his mother carried the weight of 2 jobs and a fading sense of hope. She had once dreamed of becoming a teacher herself, but life and bills had a way of rewriting plans. Still, she poured everything into her children: hot meals, warm hugs, and unshakable belief. When Elijah told her about the moment in class with Mr. Cartwright, she didn't scold him for dreaming too big. Instead, she knelt beside him, cupped his face in her calloused hands, and said, "Some people laugh because they can't see what you see. That doesn't mean it's not there." Those words settled into his bones like armor. In the quiet hours after dinner, while his sister played with her dolls and his mother folded laundry in the flicker of the television, Elijah studied. He used a hand-me-down graphing calculator with a cracked screen, memorized equations from faded textbooks bought at yard sales, and practiced building small models using cereal boxes and glue. Each night he grew a little more certain that his dream wasn't ridiculous. It was real, and it was waiting. One Sunday, while helping his grandfather weed the garden, he mentioned the name MIT for the first time. Leonard looked up slowly, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a weathered hand. "That's a fine place," he said. "They send people to space from there." Elijah nodded solemnly. "That's where I want to go." There was a pause, and then Leonard gave a slow, proud smile. "Then let's get you there, boy." And from then on, every hour Elijah spent studying was matched by stories Leonard told to inspire him. Tales of obstacles, of perseverance, of how the sky didn't belong to just one kind of person. The dream that began on that porch didn't fade. It deepened. It spread like roots beneath the surfaces of his life, quiet but unshakable. And though no one else at school seemed to believe in it, Elijah believed enough for all of them. In his mind, the sound of that distant rocket wasn't just a story. It was a promise, echoing through time, calling him forward. He didn't just want to reach the stars. He wanted to build the path so others could follow. By the time Elijah reached his junior year of high school, his dream had taken shape so clearly in his mind that it felt almost tangible, like a map etched on the inside of his heart. He could close his eyes and see the control room at NASA, the blinking lights, the tense murmurs before liftoff, the silent anticipation just before the rockets ignited. It didn't matter that he'd never been there, never even left Georgia. He carried that vision with him like a compass, a guiding star that pointed forward through every hallway, every homework assignment, every late-night study session. But as strong as that vision was, the world around him didn't always welcome it. In fact, it seemed determined to push it down, to dim its light a little more each day. At school, Elijah walked a tightrope invisible to most. He was smart, yes, but not loud about it. He didn't boast, didn't show off, and so his achievements often went unnoticed. When he aced a chemistry exam, the teacher would glance at the paper and mutter, "Well done," without eye contact. When he stayed behind after class to ask deeper questions about physics, they were often brushed aside with a dismissive, "We won't be covering that this year." It wasn't always cruelty. Sometimes it was indifference, sometimes disbelief, but it was always there, like a silent weight pressing against his shoulders. Mr. Black Cartwright remained the most vocal. That laugh from career day had not been a one-time event. He had taken to making small, cutting comments during lessons, often just loud enough for the others to hear. When Elijah answered a difficult question correctly, the response might be, "Looks like someone had a lucky guess." When he stayed behind to clarify an equation, Mr. Cartwright would glance at him over his glasses and say, "Don't wear yourself out on all that theory. You'll need your energy for real life." The worst part wasn't the words themselves. It was the way the others looked at him afterward, like maybe he really didn't belong where he was aiming. And yet Elijah kept going. He stayed up late most nights, sitting at the kitchen table while his mother dozed on the couch and the house settled into silence. He worked through equations on scrap paper, reread his science magazines until the ink wore thin, and emailed professors at universities he dreamed of attending, asking questions that few high schoolers dared to ask. Some replied with surprise, others with encouragement, but all treated him like he belonged in the conversation. It was the kind of validation he rarely received in person. Still, even with that quiet confidence, there were days when the pushback wore him down. There were days he walked the halls feeling invisible, wondering if maybe the laughter and the disbelief were right. His guidance counselor didn't help. When he met with her to discuss college applications, she smiled politely and handed him brochures for trade schools and local community colleges. "With your background," she said gently, "something hands-on might be a better fit." Elijah didn't respond. He just took the pamphlets and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him like punctuation. That night, he didn't study. He sat in the backyard instead, staring at the stars in silence, trying to remember why the dream had felt so clear. But just when the world seemed intent on closing in, something always pulled him back. Sometimes it was his little sister bringing him a glass of water and whispering, "You're gonna be famous someday." Sometimes it was his mother, folding laundry and humming softly, pausing just long enough to say, "Don't you let them tell you who you are." And sometimes it was the memory of his grandfather, his voice like gravel and honey, reminding him that rockets don't rise easily. They push against the pull of the world with everything they have because that's the only way to fly. One weekend, Elijah entered a local science fair with a propulsion model he had built from spare parts, foam board, and a salvaged bicycle pump. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. His demonstration drew polite curiosity, but few took him seriously until a retired engineer on the judging panel asked him about his equations. Elijah answered with clarity and detail, explaining the balance of thrust and drag with a quiet authority that made the man raise an eyebrow. He won third place, barely a nod compared to flashier projects, but the judge pulled him aside afterward and said, "You've got something special. Don't let the small thinkers shrink it." That moment stayed with him, not just for the words, but for the look in the man's eyes, the first adult outside his family who truly seemed to see him. Even with these small victories, the resistance didn't vanish. Teachers still doubted him. Classmates still mocked his intensity. When he wore a NASA t-shirt to school one day, someone stuck a note in his locker that read, "You ain't no rocket scientist." Elijah stared at the crumpled paper for a long time before folding it neatly and placing it in his pocket. That night he taped it inside the back of his notebook, not as a wound, but as fuel. Because the world could push and it could pull, but Elijah had learned something vital. Dreams don't need permission to grow. They just need the strength to keep rising, even when everything around them says, "Stay down." So he kept studying, he kept dreaming, he kept aiming higher, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Because every pushback, every sneer, every low expectation was just another layer of resistance, and rockets, he knew, rise best against resistance. The first time Elijah saw Mr. Foster, he was sitting quietly at the back of the auditorium during a Monday morning assembly, the kind students usually endured with glazed eyes and slow-shifting boredom. The guest speaker had been announced over the intercom earlier that week, but no one paid it much mind. These talks came and went, a parade of former students, community leaders, or tired entrepreneurs trying to inspire teenagers too distracted by weekend memories and unfinished homework. But when the principal introduced Mr. George Foster, a retired aerospace engineer who had worked on the Apollo-Soyuz project in the 70s, Elijah sat up straighter. That name, Foster, rang a bell, though he couldn't place it. And when the tall, thin man with neatly cropped gray hair and wire-frame glasses stepped up to the podium, something about his presence demanded attention without ever asking for it. Mr. Foster didn't launch into grand declarations or dramatic speeches. He spoke plainly, in a voice that had the steadiness of someone who had spent his life solving problems with logic, precision, and purpose. He told stories, not of fame or fortune, but of failures turned into discoveries, of nights spent running calculations by hand because the computers were too slow or too new, of setbacks that nearly shut down entire missions, but taught him more than success ever could. His language was technical at times, but the passion beneath it reached even those who didn't understand the science. And when he paused, the room didn't fill with coughs or shifting chairs. It stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that meant people were listening, even if they didn't yet know why. But Elijah knew. Every word lit something in him, like a beacon calling out from a fog. Here was a man who had walked through the doors Elijah dreamed of opening. And more than that, here was a black man, one of the few he'd ever seen associated with space science, who had not only entered that world, but helped build it. After the assembly, most students filed out quickly, more eager for their next class than to ask questions. Elijah lingered near the edge of the stage, gripping his binder like a lifeline. Mr. Foster was packing up, speaking quietly with the teacher, when he caught Elijah's eye and nodded. That was all the invitation Elijah needed. He introduced himself softly, but with purpose. "Sir, I just want to say your talk meant a lot. I want to be an aerospace engineer. I've wanted that since I was little." Mr. Foster studied him with a kind of deliberate warmth, the way a craftsman examines a rare piece of raw material, not for what it is, but for what it could become. He asked Elijah a few questions: what he was studying, what interested him most about propulsion systems, whether he'd ever written to a university professor before. Elijah answered each one with a mixture of nerves and precision, and with each answer, Mr. Foster's smile grew just a little wider. Before parting, he reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a card. "If you're serious," he said, "call me. I mentor a few students here and there. I don't waste time, but I don't like seeing talent go to waste either." Elijah held that card like it was made of gold. He waited 2 days before calling, rehearsing his words over and over. But when Mr. Foster picked up, there was no formality, just a simple, "Glad you called. Let's get to work." From then on, every Saturday afternoon, Elijah would ride his bike across town to Mr. Foster's modest home, where the garage had been converted into a makeshift lab. There were circuit boards, old textbooks, hand-drawn schematics taped to the walls, and the faint smell of soldered metal and machine oil. It felt like stepping into another world, one where Elijah was not just welcome, but expected. Their sessions were not easy. Mr. Foster challenged him, pushed him, asked questions that made his head spin and his pride sting. When Elijah got something wrong, he had to explain why. When he got it right, he had to prove it. But there was no ridicule, no dismissiveness, only a firm belief that he could do better, that he should. And slowly, that belief became Elijah's own. Mr. Foster taught him to write formal emails to university departments, to study patents, to draft his own designs using free software. He loaned him books and made him return them annotated. He once made Elijah redo an entire propulsion calculation because the margins weren't neat. "Details matter," he said, tapping the page. "Sloppiness on the ground becomes disaster in the sky." But it wasn't just the science that mattered. Mr. Foster told him stories late into the evening, not just about NASA, but about being the only black engineer in rooms full of men who doubted his presence before he even spoke. He taught Elijah how to stand tall in such rooms, how to speak with clarity and keep receipts. "You don't just prove them wrong," he'd say. "You prove yourself right." Those words stayed with Elijah longer than any formula. That mentorship changed the trajectory of Elijah's life. With Mr. Foster's guidance, he began applying to summer STEM camps, writing essays that combined personal history with technical ambition. He entered state-level competitions and, more often than not, placed near the top. Teachers started to notice grudgingly at first, then with genuine surprise. Even Mr. Cartwright had grown quieter, his once sneering comments replaced by long, contemplative looks during class. Still, Elijah didn't gloat. He stayed focused, working harder than ever, because he knew now that the dream wasn't just a distant hope. It was a path, one he was already walking. One afternoon, as he packed up his things after another long session in the garage, Mr. Foster handed him a sealed envelope. "Scholarship application," he said simply. "You're ready." Elijah took it with trembling hands, the weight of all those nights studying, all those years believing, condensed into one moment. As he stepped out into the fading light of day, he looked up at the sky and felt something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Not just hope, but certainty. The world had pushed back, yes, but it had also given him something rare, a guide, a hand on his shoulder, and a voice in his corner that would not let him fall. And now, with that unexpected ally beside him, Elijah was ready to rise. By the time senior year rolled around, Elijah's presence in the halls of Chestnut Grove High carried a different weight. No longer the boy others chuckled at behind cupped hands or dismissed with a shrug, he had become something else. Quietly respected, curiously watched, and subtly avoided by those who once saw him as an easy punchline. His name had begun to appear on bulletin boards outside the principal's office and in the local paper, next to words like finalist, recipient, and award. But Elijah didn't walk with swagger or seek attention. He moved with the same focused stillness he always had, eyes forward, notebooks clutched under one arm, carrying not just a dream anymore, but the proof that it was within reach. He had done it. Acceptance letters had started arriving in thin and thick envelopes, one by one, like footsteps climbing a staircase to someplace only he could picture. But none hit him quite like the one bearing the seal of an Ivy League university, his top choice. The envelope had weight to it, literal and otherwise. Inside were the words he had replayed in his mind for years. "We are pleased to inform you." When he read them aloud to his mother at the kitchen table, she covered her mouth and cried silently, her shoulders shaking, her eyes full of a pride too big to speak. That night, Elijah folded the letter neatly and placed it beside a faded photo of his grandfather at Cape Canaveral, smiling beneath a mop bucket and mop handle, a silent nod to a legacy carried forward. But joy never seems to come without its shadow. In the weeks that followed, the mood at school changed. The congratulatory remarks from some teachers came laced with a thin bitterness, as if they had bet against him and now owed him more than words. Other students whispered when he passed, and Elijah began to notice how quickly conversations died when he entered a room. Some muttered that he only got in because of scholarships, because of race, because of a sob story. He didn't respond. He had learned that silence was a weapon more powerful than argument. But what gnawed at him most wasn't the petty talk. It was the silence from one man who had once ridiculed him the loudest. Mr. Cartwright hadn't said a word. No acknowledgement, no nod of recognition, not even the smallest flicker of expression when Elijah's name was announced during the morning broadcast as a recipient of a National Science Award. It was as if he had chosen to erase the reality unfolding in front of him rather than confront it. And still, Elijah said nothing. He didn't need Mr. Cartwright's approval. Not anymore. But that absence hung heavy in the air every time he walked into class, a quiet tension that never seemed to leave. A week before graduation, Elijah stood alone in the school's science lab, gathering the last of his project materials for a regional competition he had already won. The room smelled of dust and rubbing alcohol, and the afternoon sun cast long, slanted shadows across the scratched tile floor. As he packed away his prototype, another propulsion model refined with Mr. Foster's guidance, he heard footsteps behind him. Mr. Cartwright entered the room, adjusting the sleeves of his sweater vest, his face unreadable. For a moment they stood in silence, two versions of the same past locked in one small room. "I heard you're heading up north," Mr. Cartwright said finally, his tone neutral. Elijah nodded, offering no further reply. The teacher looked around the lab, then at the prototype. "Looks complicated," he muttered. "Must have taken a lot of time." Elijah waited, searching the man's face for something, regret, apology, even curiosity. But none came. Just that same tired mask of detachment. Then Mr. Cartwright added with a trace of something that might have been irony, "Let me know when you land on the moon." He chuckled softly, as if trying to turn the past into a shared joke. Elijah didn't smile. He just looked at the man, his voice calm and unwavering. "Maybe I will," he said, "and maybe I won't come back." He turned and left without another word, the door swinging shut behind him with a quiet finality that felt like the closing chapter of a long and bitter book. Outside, the sun was brighter, the air clearer. Elijah felt the weight on his chest lift slightly as he stepped into the courtyard where students milled about, unaware of the quiet revolution that had just taken place inside that lab. He walked past them all, eyes set on the road ahead, not out of arrogance, but purpose. On the last day of school, while others scribbled goodbyes in yearbooks and took selfies by the lockers, Elijah cleaned out his locker with deliberate care. He left behind only one thing, a neatly folded piece of paper taped to the inside door. It was the same note someone had once shoved into his locker, the one that read, "You ain't no rocket scientist." He had kept it all this time, not as a wound, but as proof that every voice raised against him had helped build the silence in which he found his strength. Now he returned it, like an echo that no longer belonged to him. That night, he visited Mr. Foster one last time before leaving town. They sat in the garage lab, now dimly lit, the air filled with the hum of summer cicadas. Mr. Foster handed him a worn, leather-bound journal, its pages blank. "You'll need something to write your journey in," he said. Elijah took it with reverence. No words were needed. When he stood to leave, Mr. Foster placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "They won't see you coming," he said, but they'll remember when you leave. And with that, Elijah stepped out into the night, no longer just a boy with a dream, but a young man who had earned the right to carry it. He didn't look back at the school or the town or the people who doubted him. He didn't need to, because the path ahead wasn't just open, it was calling, and he was ready to answer. The transition from a dusty high school in Georgia to the towering stone buildings and sprawling quads of the Ivy League was like stepping from one world into another, and Elijah felt the shift with every step he took. The air smelled different, cleaner but colder. The students moved with a sharpness in their stride, dressed in wool coats and polished boots, eyes focused on futures they already seemed to believe belonged to them. Elijah arrived with a single suitcase, a folder of documents neatly organized by his mother's hand, and a head full of equations and dreams. Yet it took only a few days on campus for him to understand how far he had come and how far he still had to go. From the very first lecture, it became clear that this place was no longer content with letting him coast. The professor spoke fast and expected faster answers. The coursework was a whirlwind of deadlines, late-night study sessions, and labyrinthine problem sets that stretched well past midnight. Elijah had always been disciplined, but now he needed more than discipline. He needed endurance. He found himself alone more often than not, buried in books at the back of the library, eating meals with textbooks open beside his tray, whispering rocket equations under his breath as he walked across icy sidewalks. Every time he faltered, every time a formula wouldn't click or a concept refused to settle, he would think of Mr. Foster's voice saying, "They won't see you coming." And he would push harder, dig deeper, stay up later. But there were moments that felt like drowning. Office hours with impatient professors who barely remembered his name. Study groups where he was the only black student, the only one who had to prove over and over that he belonged. In group projects, his ideas were sometimes ignored until someone else repeated them. He learned not to flinch when someone mispronounced his name or asked where he was really from. He learned to let his work speak first, because his voice alone wasn't always enough. And still, he didn't quit. It wasn't all isolation. There were rare sparks of connection. A kind teaching assistant who saw his potential and gave him extra research problems, a girl in his programming class who shared notes without being asked, a campus mentor who had once walked a similar path and offered him a quiet place to talk when the weight got too heavy. And then, slowly, the tide began to shift. In his sophomore year, Elijah co-authored a research paper on ion propulsion systems with a professor who had initially doubted his ability to keep up. The paper was published in a respected journal, and for the first time, his name appeared not just in the margins but on the front page. That single line, Elijah Gaines, beneath a title about cutting-edge technology, felt like the sound of a door opening. The recognition didn't change him, but it changed how others saw him. Invitations began to trickle in, panels, competitions, internships. He chose carefully, accepting only those that challenged him. The summer before his junior year, he was offered an internship at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. When he opened the acceptance email, he sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the screen as if waiting for it to vanish. Then he rose from his desk and walked outside into the cold air and laughed, not loudly, but with the quiet, astonished joy of someone who had just seen a dream step closer. That summer, everything accelerated. Surrounded by engineers and scientists who had shaped missions he had studied since childhood, Elijah absorbed everything he could. He arrived early, stayed late, asked questions others were too proud to ask, and slowly earned the trust of people who had once looked through him. When one of the senior engineers noticed his efficiency in analyzing propulsion data, he was pulled into a special team working on experimental launch systems. It was demanding work, intellectually exhausting, precise to the decimal, but it felt like home. For the first time, Elijah wasn't reaching upward. He was moving forward, side by side with people he had once only admired from afar. One evening near the end of the internship, he stayed behind in the lab, tweaking a model others had abandoned for being too complex. A director walked past and paused, watching Elijah work. "You know," the man said after a long silence, "most people would have given up on that model weeks ago." Elijah looked up and replied simply, "I couldn't stop thinking about it." The director nodded. "That's the difference. We need people who can't let go." The next day, Elijah was offered an extended fellowship, something rarely offered to interns without graduate credentials. It was official now. He wasn't just visiting this world. He was part of it. When he returned to campus for his final year, something in him had changed. He moved through the hallways with the same calm, but there was steel in his spine now. Confidence not born of arrogance, but of having stood in the very place he once thought was unreachable. He didn't seek praise. He mentored freshmen who reminded him of himself, offered quiet encouragement to the ones who sat alone in study halls, and continued pushing himself in every class. By the time graduation approached, he had already accepted a full-time offer to return to NASA as a junior propulsion engineer. But more than the title or the paycheck, what mattered most to Elijah was the knowledge that he had earned his place not through luck or favors, but through grit, resilience, and an unwavering belief that he belonged. He had risen, not because others had lifted him, but because he had refused to stay grounded. And now, standing at the edge of everything he had worked for, he could finally see the horizon he had once only imagined. The dream was no longer distant. It was waiting, and he was ready. In the first few months of working full-time at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Elijah moved through each day with a mixture of awe and purpose, like a man walking through the pages of a book he had read his whole life, and now suddenly found himself living inside. The security gates opened at the scan of his badge. His email address carried a domain he had once written to as a boy with trembling fingers. And each morning, as he stepped into the heart of the Propulsion Research Division, he passed a framed photograph of the Mars Pathfinder mission, a mission his grandfather had told him about long ago, sitting on their porch, eyes full of distant skies. But now Elijah was no longer a listener of stories. He was becoming a maker of them. His first year on the team was intense. The pressure, the expectations, the constant motion of overlapping deadlines, it could have swallowed someone unprepared. But Elijah had learned long ago how to breathe in deep water. He focused on the problems no one wanted to touch, the tasks labeled too tedious or too theoretical. And slowly he carved out a reputation, not as the loudest in the room, but as the one who could find order in complexity. He became known for his calm, for his methodical way of thinking, and for asking the right questions at the right time. His quiet confidence was the kind that made others lean in when he spoke, not out of obligation, but because they knew he saw things they might have missed. Then came the moment that changed everything. A senior project, codenamed Vulcan, was behind schedule. It involved a new propulsion concept that, if successful, could reduce travel time for deep space probes by nearly 30%. Months of work had yielded little progress. The lead engineer had resigned under pressure. Rumors circulated that the entire initiative might be scrapped. Elijah, still technically junior, had no business volunteering to take it on. But he did. Not with a loud proposal or grand speech. He stayed late one night, running simulations on the Vulcan files long after most of the building had gone dark. What he found wasn't magic. It was a pattern, a recurring instability in the software that no one had isolated. He restructured the codebase, rewrote a set of performance algorithms from scratch, and by morning the simulation showed stability for the first time in 6 months. When his supervisor discovered what he had done, there was silence, then disbelief, then a call to the director's office. Elijah was summoned, nervous but steady, expecting either reprimand or redirection. Instead, the director handed him a seat at the table. "You're leading the recalibration on this," he said, effective immediately. It was the first time Elijah sat in a meeting room surrounded not by classmates or professors, but by seasoned engineers, some with silver in their hair and others with resumes thicker than textbooks. He didn't try to impress them. He let the data speak. And over time, they listened, not because they had to, but because they realized he had earned the right. With Elijah at the helm of the recalibration team, the Vulcan project found new life. The months that followed were filled with 12-hour days, sleepless nights, and a blur of code reviews and whiteboard diagrams. He missed holidays, he missed birthdays, but he didn't complain, not once, because every long hour was a step towards something bigger, something that didn't just carry his name, but his purpose. One afternoon, as he watched a test engine fire with near-perfect efficiency, a fellow engineer clapped him on the back and said, "You're the reason this thing's going to fly." Elijah smiled but didn't reply. He thought of his grandfather instead, and how somewhere, beyond sight, beyond stars, he might be watching. But recognition always brings attention. And attention, Elijah knew, came with a double edge. Soon he was asked to speak on panels, to attend conferences, to sit for interviews where his face was paired with words like trailblazer and prodigy. Some praised his work, some questioned how quickly he had risen. And while most offered genuine admiration, a few voices surfaced from shadowed corners, murmuring that he had been given too much, too fast. Elijah had heard that tune before, back in high school hallways, in whispered guidance counselor conversations. It no longer hurt. But it did remind him that no matter how high you climbed, someone would always wonder if you took the stairs or the elevator. So he kept working, kept learning, kept climbing. It was during one of those public events, a symposium on advanced propulsion held at a major university, that a familiar face appeared in the audience. After the talk, as he shook hands and answered questions, a woman approached him slowly. She wore a navy coat, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were unmistakable. "Miss Dandridge," he whispered, stunned. She smiled gently. "I told you there was room for you out there," she said, "but I never imagined how far you'd go." They spoke for several minutes, catching up between bursts of applause from passers-by, and before she left, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "They're watching you now, Elijah. Don't forget who's still watching from where you came." That night, Elijah sat alone in his hotel room, the city lights casting soft shadows on the wall, and wrote a letter to his mother, handwritten like she preferred. At the bottom, he added a line in small script. "We're rising, Mom, just like I promised." That moment, somewhere between past and future, marked the turning point not just in Elijah's career, but in his sense of who he was. No longer the dreamer on the porch, no longer the student seeking approval. He was now the builder of systems, the designer of trajectories, the voice in the room that mattered. And though the journey ahead was still vast and full of stars, for the first time, Elijah felt the ground beneath him not as a limitation, but as something he had already left behind. It had been nearly 7 years since Elijah last set foot on the cracked pavement of Chestnut Grove, and yet, the minute he turned off the interstate and rolled past the rusted town sign that read, "Welcome to Willow Creek, where families grow," it all came back with startling clarity. The air was heavier here, slower somehow, like the town itself breathed in deeper and exhaled with a long drawl. The familiar rows of leaning mailboxes, the worn grocery store with its flickering neon open sign, the barber shop with the same 3 old men still sitting on the bench out front. It was all frozen in a kind of timeless stillness that made Elijah wonder if he had changed too much to belong here anymore. But as he steered the car down Maple Street toward his mother's house, a different feeling settled in. A warmth, not unlike returning to the pages of a book he had once known by heart. The reason for his visit wasn't glamorous. There was no press, no speaking engagement, no curated agenda. It was homecoming in the truest sense. His mother had taken a bad fall weeks prior, and though she insisted it was nothing, just a slip, not a story, Elijah booked a flight the moment he heard. She greeted him at the door with a cane in one hand and stubborn pride in the other, trying to hide her limp behind a smile. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said, but her voice trembled, and her arms folded around him tighter than words could. Inside, the house was just as he remembered. The same brown couch with the sun-faded armrest, the same ticking clock above the kitchen doorway, and on the fridge, aged newspaper clippings of every science fair he'd ever won, yellowing but still neatly pinned. He spent the first few days fussing over her like she had once done for him, adjusting pillows, brewing tea, refusing to let her lift a single pan in the kitchen. They talked long into the nights, their conversations moving between memory and marvel. She wanted to know everything about his work, his coworkers, the engines he was building, and the places they might one day reach. He told her stories, not all at once, but scattered between cups of coffee and late-night bowls of ice cream, and each one lit her eyes the way only pride and disbelief can. "Imagine that," she'd whisper, "my baby talking to machines that touch the stars." One afternoon, she asked if he might drive her to the local library, her favorite quiet place, and he agreed without hesitation. But as they passed the old high school, something shifted in his chest. The building stood just as it always had, flat brick walls, chipped white trim, and that chain-link fence that never really kept anything out. But something about it made him slow the car. "Mind if we stop here for a minute?" he asked. She looked at him, understanding flashing in her gaze, and nodded. Elijah stepped out alone, leaving her in the car with the window cracked and the radio humming low. He walked the sidewalk leading to the main entrance, pausing at the flagpole where he'd once stood with shaking knees during morning announcements. A group of students spilled out of the side door, laughing, backpacks swinging, and none gave him a second glance. That was fine. He wasn't here to be recognized. He was here to remember. The hallway inside smelled the same, floor wax and old paper, and as he walked past the office toward the science wing, he caught his reflection in a dark window. For a moment, he saw the boy he once was, binder clutched to his chest, shoulders hunched slightly, eyes scanning for safe places. But then the glass reflected back the man he had become, taller, sharper, grounded. He kept walking. Mr. Cartwright was still there, though grayer and slightly stooped, standing at the front of room 212 as if the years had never moved. Elijah watched from the hallway as the man scribbled on the board, pausing to lecture a group of half-listening students about Newton's laws. The bell rang. Students filed out, barely glancing his way, and Mr. Cartwright turned to pack his bag. Elijah stepped into the doorway. The teacher looked up, and for the first time in years, their eyes met. "Elijah Gaines," Mr. Cartwright said, the name falling slowly from his mouth like a question and a statement all at once. "Didn't expect to see you back here." Elijah smiled, but there was no malice in it, only reflection. "Just visiting," he said. "My mother had a fall. I'm in town for a bit." Mr. Cartwright nodded. "I heard about your work," he said. "NASA, right? Big things, lot of people talking." Elijah shrugged gently. "I just kept going, like I said I would." There was a pause, thick with things that had never been said. Mr. Cartwright looked down at his bag, then back up. "You proved a lot of people wrong." Elijah held his gaze. "I wasn't trying to. I just needed to prove myself right." With that, he extended a hand. The old teacher took it, hesitantly, firmly, and for a brief second something like understanding passed between them, not forgiveness, not apology, just acknowledgement. That night, Elijah drove out to the edge of town where the stars were brightest. He sat on the hood of his car, his mother resting beside him in a blanket, the air cool and filled with cicadas. "You ever miss it?" she asked. "Before all this?" He looked up at the sky. "I miss the dreaming," he said. "Back then I didn't know the limits. Everything felt possible, but now I know the work it takes to make it real." She nodded slowly. "Still dreaming, though," he smiled, "always." And there, beneath the same stars he used to whisper to as a boy, Elijah felt the full circle of his journey pressed gently against his heart. He had returned, not to reclaim something, but to honor it. The roots of his dream were here, and no matter how far he traveled, this quiet town, this porch, this night, would always be part of his sky. When Elijah received the invitation, it arrived not in an email or a formal envelope, but in a phone call from a familiar voice, weathered by time but still laced with the quiet authority he remembered. It was Mr. Foster, who had never once raised his voice, yet whose words had carried Elijah through years of doubt like a compass through fog. "I need a favor," he said simply. "Not for me, for the next one." He didn't elaborate, but Elijah didn't need him to. He booked a flight home that same evening. The following Saturday, Elijah stood once again in the familiar garage-turned-lab, sunlight spilling through the windows, casting golden lines across the floor littered with coils, wires, and yellowing schematics. Mr. Foster's hair was thinner now, his back more stooped, but his eyes burned with the same fire that had once ignited a dream in a boy too often told to dream smaller. "I've got a student," he said. 12 years old, smart, smarter than I was at that age, smarter than you were, maybe. He just needs to see someone who looks like him doing what he thinks is impossible. Elijah didn't hesitate. That afternoon, a boy named Caleb arrived at the house, nervously fidgeting with a backpack strap as Mr. Foster introduced them. He was shy, with big round glasses and questions that came out in quiet bursts when he thought no one was paying attention. Elijah knelt beside him at the workbench and started explaining a basic thruster principle, but by the time the sun had set, they were knee-deep in an animated discussion about orbital decay and satellite drift. Caleb's eyes shone with the same light Elijah remembered in himself, and as he left that evening, Elijah knew this was no temporary mentorship. This was a passing of the torch. In the weeks that followed, Elijah returned more often, balancing his life at NASA with weekends in Willow Creek. He and Mr. Foster began hosting Saturday workshops in the community center, classes open to any child with curiosity and courage. They called it Skybound, and what started with a few chairs and borrowed laptops quickly grew into a room packed with children and parents alike, hungry for possibility. Elijah didn't lecture. He listened. He told stories, not just of spacecraft and science, but of the boy he once was, sitting in a public school classroom where no one believed in him, and the man he had to become in order to believe in himself. As the program grew, so did the attention. Local news outlets picked up the story. A small write-up appeared in the Sunday paper, headlined "From Rocket Dreams to Rocket Reality." Eventually, a documentary team requested to film a session. Elijah agreed, but only on the condition that the focus remain on the kids. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about who comes next." One afternoon, after the workshop ended and the folding chairs had been stacked away, Elijah walked outside to find a group of students clustered near the parking lot, all gathered around a limousine that hadn't been there earlier. For a moment, confusion flickered in his eyes. But then a voice called out from behind. "Elijah Gaines," the driver said with a grin. "NASA sent me. They said to bring you to the city for tonight's award dinner." It was the kind of moment that would have stunned his younger self into silence. But now, Elijah simply laughed, full, rich, and unafraid. He turned to the kids, who stared wide-eyed at the sleek black car. "You see that?" he said. "That's what happens when you keep showing up. When you work so hard, the world has no choice but to notice." But it wasn't just the students watching. From across the street, a teacher emerged, older now but unmistakable in his stiff walk and familiar corduroy blazer. Mr. Cartwright approached slowly, looking not at the car, but at the man standing beside it. "I never thought," he began, but the sentence trailed off like a question he no longer expected an answer to. Elijah met his gaze without bitterness. "Neither did I," he said softly, "but here we are." There was a pause, a moment so still it could have shattered. Then Mr. Cartwright nodded, eyes glinting with something between regret and recognition, and turned away. Later that night, Elijah stood before a crowd of aerospace leaders, scientists, and scholars as he accepted a national award for innovation in propulsion systems. The applause was thunderous, but as he stepped to the podium, he didn't talk about equations or velocity or orbital dynamics. He spoke of a classroom where a boy's dream had been dismissed with a laugh, and of the people who chose to lift him instead of leaving him behind. He spoke of Mr. Foster, of his mother, of Miss Dandridge and the quiet power of a hand placed on a shoulder, and he ended with a story about a boy named Caleb, who now stayed after every workshop to ask questions too big for his notebook to hold. When he finished, the room was silent, and then the applause rose again, not for the science, but for the story behind it, for the long, hard, winding road that had led a black boy from a small southern town to the stars. And afterward, as Elijah walked out into the night, award in hand, he didn't climb into the limousine waiting by the curb. Instead, he pulled out his phone, dialed a number he knew by heart, and smiled as it rang. "Mr. Foster," he said when the line connected, "we're just getting started." And in that moment, surrounded by steel and glass and a sky stretching endlessly above, Elijah knew that he had not only come full circle, he had bent the circle outward, wide enough to let others step in behind him. The dream had never just been his. It had always belonged to everyone brave enough to believe. The winter sun rose late that morning, casting long amber streaks across the streets of Washington, D.C., where the sidewalks glistened with a faint frost and the city pulsed with its usual quiet rhythm of authority. Elijah stood in front of a full-length mirror inside a hotel suite, adjusting the collar of his crisp navy suit, a shade deeper than the color of the sky he had chased for most of his life. Outside the window, he could see the top of the Capitol building, standing proud and resolute, a symbol of the nation's promise and its contradictions. He took a deep breath and straightened the silver pin on his lapel, a tiny emblem of a rocket, gifted to him years ago by Mr. Foster, now worn close to his heart like a quiet oath. Today was not just another ceremony. It was the moment when everything, every slight, every late night, every whispered doubt would be answered not with revenge, but with presence. He wasn't here to prove anyone wrong anymore. He was here because he had earned his place. The letter had come weeks earlier, signed by a U.S. Senator, and sealed with the insignia of the National Medal of Science. It invited him to the White House to receive the nation's highest scientific honor for his work on the Vulcan propulsion system, now a cornerstone of NASA's interplanetary missions. The award recognized not only the technology he had pioneered, but the vision he had carried forward, of what was possible when brilliance met perseverance. Elijah hadn't told many people, not out of secrecy, but humility. He had quietly flown his mother out the night before, arranged a car for Mr. Foster, and reserved a seat for Caleb, who had never even been on a plane before. They would all be in the front row. They had to be. As he entered the East Room of the White House, a hush fell over the crowd of dignitaries, officials, and fellow honorees. Chandeliers sparkled overhead. Cameras clicked softly. At the far end of the room stood the president, smiling warmly as Elijah approached the stage. The words that followed, about courage, innovation, and breaking barriers, felt distant and dreamlike. But when the medal was placed around his neck, heavy with gold and history, the applause that filled the room didn't echo with finality. It resonated with a new beginning. For Elijah, it wasn't a crowning moment. It was a gateway, a call to continue. As the ceremony ended and the attendees gathered for photographs and handshakes, the president pulled him aside briefly, lowering his voice with sincere gravity. "You remind this country," he said, "of what it can be when we listen to the ones we once overlooked." But it wasn't the praise of powerful people that moved Elijah most that day. It was the look on his mother's face as she held his hand afterward, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as she whispered, "You did it, baby. You really did it." It was the way Mr. Foster stood in the corner, arms folded, eyes misted not with surprise but with quiet satisfaction. And it was Caleb, wide-eyed, dressed in a too-big suit, clutching a signed copy of Elijah's research summary, who kept staring at the medal as if it held the secret to flight itself. Elijah knelt down, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "This is yours too," he said. "Someday, you'll have one of your own." The boy nodded, and in that nod was a silent contract with the future. After the reception, Elijah found himself wandering alone through the National Air and Space Museum, which had stayed open late by special request. The halls were quiet, echoing with the faint hum of exhibits and the distant sound of a tour guide's voice. He passed by the Spirit of St. Louis, the Apollo 11 command module, and a scale model of the Mars rover. But it was the display near the far end, a modest exhibit about the early days of propulsion research, that brought him to a stop. There, encased in glass, was a replica of a prototype remarkably similar to the one he had first built in Mr. Foster's garage. A small placard beneath it bore his name. He stood there a long time, staring not at the hardware, but at the dream it represented, now immortalized in polished steel and museum lighting. As he turned to leave, a museum staff member approached cautiously, holding a guest book. "Would you mind signing?" she asked, eyes glowing. "A lot of kids will see this." Elijah took the pen and wrote slowly, choosing each word with care. "The stars are not far. They're just waiting for us to reach," he inscribed, followed by his name and the date. He handed the book back and stepped outside into the cold night where the moon hung low over the city, glowing soft and full. In the car ride back to the hotel, he sat in silence, watching the world blur by, the monuments, the marble, the stories etched into every building. But in his heart, he wasn't in Washington. He was back in a high school hallway, clutching a binder, hearing laughter behind him. He was on a porch beside his mother, listening to stories of rockets and space. He was in a garage with Mr. Foster, hands stained with grease and dreams. And now, all of those pieces had come together. not to make a hero, but to make a bridge between what had been and what could still be. That night, as he finally rested, metal set gently beside the nightstand and phone full of congratulatory messages left unread, Elijah closed his eyes, not with exhaustion, but with peace. He knew the journey wasn't over. There were still missions to lead, students to mentor, systems to build, barriers to break. But for now, for this one night, the world had turned its gaze toward him, not in doubt, but in celebration. And somewhere, in a small town in Georgia, under a sky wide with stars, a boy with big glasses and even bigger questions was lying awake, staring upward, knowing that dreams, real, earth-shaking, sky-reaching dreams, were not just for someone else anymore. They were for him too. Years passed, and the world changed in ways both great and subtle. But Elijah Gaines remained a name that carried weight. Not the heavy weight of fame or spectacle, but the steady, enduring gravity of someone who had become a cornerstone in the silent architecture of progress. His days were no longer filled with proving he belonged. That chapter had long closed. Instead, his focus turned outward toward building doors where there had once only been walls. Every morning he rose early, not out of habit or discipline anymore, but out of desire, a deep, unwavering pull to do more, to give more, to be the light he once had to chase in the dark. Skybound, the mentorship program that began with a few folding chairs and hopeful hearts in a small-town community center, had grown into something far bigger than he ever imagined. It now operated chapters in over 30 cities across the country, partnering with public schools, universities, and aerospace companies to bring STEM education to underserved youth. It offered scholarships, internships, hands-on training, and perhaps most importantly, a place where kids who had once been overlooked were seen, heard, and believed in. Elijah didn't just attach his name to the program. He was there, present at the workshops when he could be, responding to emails from students late into the night, FaceTiming young engineers with trembling voices and big ideas. To them, he wasn't a distant figurehead. He was Mr. Gaines, a mentor, a friend, sometimes even a lifeline. He kept working at NASA too, but now in a different capacity. No longer the wide-eyed junior engineer tucked away in labs, Elijah became one of the agency's youngest directors, overseeing initiatives that pushed the boundaries of human possibility. He led the propulsion team for the Aether Project, a mission to explore the icy moons of Jupiter, and played a key role in designing hybrid systems for future manned-Mars landings. But titles meant little to him now. What mattered were the people, the young minds he nurtured, the voices he amplified, the barriers he quietly dismantled in every boardroom he stepped into. He never demanded a seat at the table anymore. He designed the table and invited others to sit beside him. At conferences and panels, when asked about his greatest achievement, Elijah never spoke first of medals or missions. Instead, he spoke of Caleb. The boy with big glasses was no longer a boy. He had just graduated top of his class from MIT and had been accepted into NASA's Graduate Research Fellowship under Elijah's guidance. And one evening, after a particularly long shift in the lab, Caleb walked into Elijah's office and placed a small box on the desk. Inside was a model, a miniaturized replica of the Vulcan system, handcrafted and engraved with the words, "Because you believed first." Elijah didn't cry, but he looked out the window for a long time after Caleb left, his heart full and silent. That night, he called Mr. Foster, now retired and living in South Carolina, and told him everything. "He's better than I ever was," Elijah said. "He's going to build things I can't even imagine." Mr. Foster laughed gently. "That's the point," he replied. "You made space for him." With time, Elijah began to pull back from the public eye. Not because he was tired, but because he wanted others to lead. He gave talks less frequently, choosing to spotlight new voices. He stepped down from official titles so others could rise. And eventually, he moved back to Willow Creek, not to retreat, but to return, fully and finally, to where it all began. He bought a modest home not far from his mother's, now older, but still sharp and full of stories. He renovated the old garage with Mr. Foster's blessing and turned it into a neighborhood science hub, free for kids to come tinker, explore, ask questions, and make mistakes. On Saturdays, he could be found there in a worn hoodie, sleeves rolled up, laughing with children over failed circuits and exploding soda bottle rockets. There were no news crews, no flashbulbs, just joy and discovery. And sometimes when the evening fell quiet and the porch lights buzzed in the summer air, Elijah would sit alone under the stars with a journal in his lap, sketching ideas that might never be built, but still needed to be dreamed. He never stopped dreaming. That was the secret, not success or status, but the dream that had never let him go, even when the world tried to. And when he looked up at the night sky, he no longer saw it as something distant and unreachable. He saw it as a map of all the steps he'd taken and all the footsteps still to come. Elijah Gaines never wrote a memoir, but his story was written in 1,000 other ways. In the students he mentored, the systems he built, the doors he opened, and the lives he changed without ever asking for recognition. In classrooms across the country, teachers spoke his name as a story of what's possible. In lecture halls, his quotes appeared beside diagrams and data. And in the hearts of young dreamers, especially those who looked like him, who came from where he did, he lived on, not as a myth, but as proof. On the wall of the garage-turned-science hub, there hung a single photo. It showed a younger Elijah standing beside Mr. Foster, both smiling, covered in grease, holding a half-built rocket engine between them. Beneath it, carved into a small brass plate, were the words, "They laughed at his dream, so he built it." And so, from a quiet boy with a dream dismissed in a high school classroom to a man who touched the stars and helped others reach for them too, Elijah Gaines showed us something powerful, that the journey from laughter to legacy begins the moment we believe in ourselves, even when no one else does. His story isn't just about rockets or medals, it's about resilience, about hope, and about the incredible things that can happen when one voice dares to say, "I will not be defined by your doubt." Thank you so much for watching and listening to this story. Your time means the world, and I hope it left you inspired, uplifted, or even just reminded of the strength inside all of us. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss another journey like this one. Don't forget to like the video. It really helps more people discover these powerful stories. And most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts, or tell us about a moment when someone underestimated you and how you proved them wrong. Your story might just inspire someone else who needs to hear it today. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep believing in your dream, no matter who laughs at it.